Yes, as we've been discussing this morning, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has called Russian forces butchers after investigators discovered the bodies of hundreds of mutilated civilians as Ukrainian forces slowly begin to retake Russian-held areas of the country.
Yeah, really disturbing and indeed very graphic stuff, that actually. Joining us now to discuss this harrowing story further is Major General Sir Tim Cross, a retired British Army Major General with over 30 years service. Look, thank you so much for joining us. I suppose the big question is, are these war crimes?
Well, I suspect they are, but actually proving it is never going to be easy. I was a witness, actually, at the International Court in The Hague for war crimes in the Balkans. I served there 3 times in the 90s, and it is very difficult to prove and convict people of war crimes. One of the issues is finding the people who actually did it on the ground, the tactical level, if you like. And then there's the issue of the commanders and whether they actually ordered this to happen, or whether they ignored it, or whatever the circumstances were. But I don't have any doubts at all that there is terrible things happening in Ukraine. I have to say, probably on both sides to some degree, but nonetheless, I'm sure the Russian atrocities are far worse, and what we're seeing here is clear evidence of that.
Yeah, and on that point about it being very difficult to actually collate the evidence and ultimately convict, I mean, are there anything else then that can be done to just highlight the horrors of what is going on?
Well, the media obviously is a key part of that, and getting people out on the ground, gathering the evidence. What you have to have is clearly the people who can gather that evidence and produce it in court. So, hearsay is not enough. Even photographic evidence actually is not sufficient in and of itself, because when people are, in inverted commas, scattered around, their dead bodies, etc., it's very difficult to prove how they were killed. Now, some of the stories we're hearing is that the people are, in mass graves or gathered together under tarpaulins or whatever. So, there are certain ways of doing that, but you do need clear evidence that's going to stand up in court. Because, rightly or wrongly, whoever ends up by being indicted will have defense lawyers and so forth who will do all they can to pull the evidence apart. These are not surprising. What is happening is not surprising. I'm afraid that in the UK and the West generally, we've become a little bit, we've become very, very, not arrogant, but we don't understand the terrible things that go on in these places. I mean, I've watched the mass graves being dug up in Iraq. I've seen what people do to each other in places like Northern Ireland. My brigade built and ran refugee camps in Kosovo. War is always chaos, uncertainty, and awful things, terrible things happening on both sides. And we shouldn't be surprised that this has happened. Now, that doesn't mean to say we shouldn't take it, as we are, quite rightly, extremely seriously. And we should do all we can to help the Ukraine in particular to gather the evidence that's going to end up by putting people in front of that international court.
Yes, but just on that, just to clarify, I think, for our listeners, our viewers as well, of course, which is that realistically, unless they find the actual individuals who have shot civilians in the back of the head or raped women, etc., they, I suppose, could always say, their commanders could always say, well, they were not aware of it, they were retreating or whatever, they were ahead of their troops, potentially, they were not aware of it. Putin himself, of course, can say, presumably, look, how can I have possibly ordered this? Look at me, I'm in a bunker in the Kremlin, So realistically, it's unlikely that anyone is probably ever going to get charged with war crimes for what we're seeing, is that right?
Well, I would hope somebody will in the end. I mean, it takes a long time. We're still seeing people indicted as a result of Kosovo and indeed of the Balkans and so on. But what part of this is the culture of the organisations we're talking about. In the British military, we put a lot of time and effort into teaching our guys things like the Geneva Conventions, the laws of armed conflict, the rules of engagement, and there is evidential proof that we do that. So the culture is a part of how the soldiers will, behave and react on the battlefield. So investigating how people are trained, what they're taught, how they're dealt with when things go wrong is all a part of this picture. But nonetheless, it is, I'm afraid, very difficult to prove individuals are culpable at the end of the day. There will be all sorts of reasons why people will be able to cover themselves over and so on. But it doesn't mean to say we mustn't try. It doesn't mean to say that we mustn't do what is happening now, which is, as this evidence is uncovered, photographic evidence is pulled together, the highly trained guys who go in and do and investigate these sort of crimes. I mean, when I say I watched the war graves being, or the graves, the mass graves being dug up, there were people there from around the world gathering that evidence. They knew what they were doing, and they were able to pull together some pretty insightful reports. So that must happen. We must ensure that happens collectively.
And also on that point that you made earlier about whether perhaps there is an arrogance or an unawareness on the part of Western countries about the brutal reality of war. I mean, on that point, what do you think about how the war has been covered? I mean, I've heard some commentators saying that overwhelmingly the media has kind of focused on the refugees, which is, of course, an important aspect, but not actually really put to the fore the reality of the conflict when it comes to what it's like on the ground. And maybe there would be a different reaction if we actually focus much more on the conflict rather than the kind of broader consequences, such as the outpouring of refugees. What do you make of that?
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, it was interesting in your introduction. You talked about the fact that we blur out the pictures of what is happening. We haven't got, of course, when I went in on operations, we used to have UK media alongside us, people like Kate Adie and lots of others, Martin Bell and so on, who were alongside us and were taking photographs and producing daily reports and so on. I don't want to be unfair to the media thus far, but reporting from a rooftop in Kyiv or from cellars in Kyiv or other cities doesn't bring home the reality of what's happening. So having media up front alongside is where you really want this to be. Now, I don't know whether the Ukrainian military have stopped, in inverted commas, international journalists being up front, although we are beginning to see far more of that with journalists working closer to the front. But, how you portray this on the media is really important. Now, you would expect me to say, I think people need to see the reality of what war is like, because we can become very immune to it. I mean, people play video games and so forth, but that's not what these operations are like on the ground. It is always chaos. It is always, terrible impact of, artillery and rocket attacks and so on. It's all very well, as we're now seeing, buildings with holes in them, but that doesn't really bring home the reality of what's happening to individual people and collectively on the ground. So yeah, there's a difficult balance here, but I would say the refugee crisis is clearly important. And as I said earlier, my brigade built around refugee camps, so I've got a lot of sympathy with that. But the hardness, the cruelty, the reality of what it's like to be involved in battle, is very difficult to portray. But I think we should see a bit more of it, probably.
I'm inclined to agree. Thank you very much, Sir Tim Cross, Major General Sir Tim Cross, the retired British Army Major General.
Thank you.
With more than 30 years of service. Thank you very, very much. And, yeah, I mean, look, he certainly spoke a lot of sense.
I thought that was very insightful perspectives offered there by Major General, because I think there's a lot of truth. And I read an article, funnily enough, recently by Brendan O'Neill and Spiked Online, who talked about the fact that overwhelmingly the coverage, understandably so in some instances, has been of the refugees, but it's been kind of victims or, children and women and elderly people, which invites us to emote. And obviously it's a very harrowing thing, but we need to also get our head around about the real geopolitical reality and the brutality of war on the ground,
absolutely,
which is overwhelmingly fought by men. And I think that has not always been at the forefront.
No, it's not. And I think it's an important point as well that there will be issues going on both sides. I think it's important not to sit here and say, well, look, I'm sure the Ukrainian troops even are entirely squeaky clean, but it's almost kind of not the point, really.
Well, one is invading, another country, and, what one is in their homeland defending. So I think even then there is a huge power imbalance there.
No, absolutely. And yes, it's devastating stuff that's happened. Interesting one here from Alan, who says, I wonder how quickly all this is over, that people start trading with Russia again. And I wonder whether or not, with things like we're seeing right now happening, could be the tipping point for that, whether or not that will happen. Having said that, though, capitalism, greed.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I don't know whether it's a good or bad thing at this stage, but I think that will be a reality.
Yeah.
Just, for example, right now, they are still dependent, Western Europe, on Russian gas, and so that is just something that's unavoidable. And Putin actually said in the last few days that if they want to continue getting their energy, they'll have to pay in rubles, and they have rejected that. So I do think that is something we'll have to confront.
I agree completely. Well, look, keep these views coming in. They're coming in thick and fast, actually. I'm trying to keep on top of them all there. GBViews at gbnews.uk. We'll go to those a little bit later in the show.